Okay, if you were a sea creature, what would you choose to be and why? I think you should just mess with Paul and say, I'm gonna have a shark's head on a killer whale's body with the tail of a dolphin.
Dad, that's not a sea creature though.
But you should, well, okay, you can pick one up, but I just thought we should mess with Paul.
No.
All right.
Are we recording?
I'm pretty sure we are. This is Meet the Ocean Kids Talk. Meet the ocean.
Welcome to another episode of Meet the Ocean. I'm your host, Paul North, and on today's episode, we hear about what it is like to grow up in Alaska from a young lady who has quite a keen eye for finding wildlife. But before we do, I would like to remind everyone that Meet the Ocean is a listener-supported podcast and nonprofit. That means we rely on your support to help us continue telling the story of our planet. We believe in the power of storytelling, and since you are listening, we think you might feel the same way. So here are 2 ways you can help. Number 1, join our Patreon community. Even $1 a month can make a big difference if enough people chip in, and you will have behind-the-scenes access and get to take home some ocean art or photography. Number 2, share our podcast on your social media and with your friends and family. We are building a community of creative conservationists after all, and we want everyone to know how fantastic our planet is and why we need to protect it. You can find more podcasts, underwater creatures, and ways to donate on our website, meettheocean.org. And now, onto our episode.
I mean, there's so many sea creatures to decide, but I think it would be pretty cool to be a sea otter maybe, because they just kind of hang out on the water all day long and it just seems really relaxing, and they look like they're having such a fun time, swimming around in all the waves and floating on their back in the sunshine, so that sounds pretty nice to me. I'm Taya Nielsen and I'm 12 years old and I live in Gustavus, Alaska. I live next to the national park, Glacier Bay. So our town, Gustavus, is about 10 miles from the national park. Well, we live in Alaska, but we live very near to the capital, Juneau. So about how many miles away from there?
About 35 air miles.
Yeah, so we live pretty darn close to Juneau. It's just the only thing is there's too many mountains and too much water between us that there's no roads, so the only way to get to where we live is by plane or by boat.
I had the privilege of meeting Taya very far away from Alaska, in the magical waters that surround the Mexican peninsula of Baja California. I was working on board the National Geographic Venture along with her father, Sean, who works as a photography instructor. We were there to snorkel, to watch dolphins jump into sunsets, but primarily I would say we were there to hang out with some gray whales. There were a few beachcombing adventures where I was teaching people about the various washed-up, sun-bleached marine life along the shoreline, but could quickly tell that Taya needed no natural history lectures from the likes of me. She was connected to the ocean, even though the beach she was standing on was far from the waters she calls home. So I thought that it would be pretty cool to hear from her and her dad about what it's like to grow up in Alaska.
Describe Alaska to someone who has never seen it before.
Alaska is a really diverse place because there's a lot of really small communities and some bigger ones, and there's no 2 places in Alaska that are exactly the same. So I think Alaska is just full of a lot of really different places and different people.
Okay, what is the ocean like where you live?
Well, first of all, it's very cold, but there's also a lot of things living there, so it's a big part of the ecosystem, even though that's not really the part of Alaska that you see most of the time, unless you're a scuba diver. where we live, there's a lot of islands and inlets and things like that. So a lot of the time when you're out on a boat, you can actually see the shore around you, and you can watch the wildlife like bears and stuff on the shore. So yeah, there's a lot of big mountains and things around you, and everything was really just carved out by the glaciers around us. So that's one of the things that makes it a more unique landscape, because of all the intricate waterways in Glacier Bay.
What is tide pooling and why is it so cool?
Well, when you're on the beach and the tide goes out, sometimes if there's a lower spot on the beach, some of the salt water will stay there. So basically, the tide will be out, so it's just a big beach, but there's some small like pools of salt water, and some of the creatures like sea stars and urchins and things like that are in those tide pools. So when it's a low tide, you can go down there and find all these really cool sea creatures that you usually wouldn't be able to see. At our town, we have a dock, and part of the dock, they're what are they doing with it?
They're kind of rebuilding it or refurbishing it.
They're kind of rebuilding the dock, and one of the big floating parts of the dock got pulled ashore, and there had been a bunch of stuff growing on like the underside of the dock. And once it was pulled up onto the beach, you could see all of this really cool like kelp and anemones and sea stars and a bunch of really cool, bright, colorful sea life on the sides of this dock.
Have you ever seen a whale? And if yes, well, tell us more.
Yes, I've definitely seen whales. There's a lot of whales in our national park, and they come in the summertime, and then once it's winter, they go down to Hawaii and sometimes Mexico. So there's about 150 whales in Glacier Bay, and our family owns a boat, so we often go out into Glacier Bay and we see whales feeding or sleeping or diving around with their calves. And so yes, I've seen a lot of whales, and I've seen them doing a lot of cool things. And my mom is a whale biologist, and she works for the national park, so she often points out the whales and has taught us a lot of things about them over the years. At the national park, they basically have an ID for all of the whales based on the markings on their tails or their flukes. So each of the scientists has a number for each of the whales that they somehow memorize. So when they go out on their whale surveys to look for whales and take notes on information about them, they can often recognize the whales based on their number. And so when we're out on our boat, sometimes my mom will recognize a whale and know the whole backstory of that whale because she recognized the markings on its fluke. Sometimes whales just aren't seen for a long period of time. So, or maybe my mom will say, oh, that one has a calf, and last year they didn't have one. So there's just a lot of information that you can get from them just by seeing them. One of the times that we were coming back from a small town near here on our boat, it was really sunny, and several times we saw whales bubble net feeding, which is when they feed on a bunch of small fish and things like that. And the way that they do it is they create all these bubbles with their mouths, basically, and like a group of whales will get together and create all of these bubbles to trap the fish, because the bubbles are so powerful and there's so many of them that the fish basically get trapped in the middle. And it looks really cool because when you're watching it from a boat, you see all these whales' mouths up at the surface in a circle, and all these bubbles coming up and like splashing water, and fish like flying around and seagulls diving to try and get the fish. And it's just a really, really cool thing to see. And it was especially cool because of how sunny and nice it was, and we saw it several times. That's a pretty rare thing to see. I don't think that someone's age should determine how much they should care about the planet, because, you know, everyone is either helping the planet or creating more issues, but I think for most people it's kind of a mix of both. So everyone on the planet is has kind of created the environment that we have now. And I think that the older people should try and help as much as they can, because, they should care about the other people that are going to have to deal with everything. I think that the younger people should also care a lot about it, because they're going to have to live on that planet for the rest of their life, and we're going to be alive for the time when we really need to change things, just basically right now. All the generations before us have had plenty of time to create all these problems, but by the time it got to us, we don't even have time to continue creating these issues, because everything is just going to be over before we even have time to create a buildup of more issues. But I think that it's not like the older people were horrible and we're great. We're all making mistakes. A lot of people who don't live near an ocean, or just who haven't really been able to visit oceans very often, think of the ocean as just this big place full of salt water, but really there's it's really just like a spider web full of all these intricate little things that all affect each other. So when one small thing dies, or there's something affecting it, it affects everything else. So although it doesn't seem like some species of fish going extinct is a big deal, it actually is, because there's things that eat those fish and things that eat the fish. So even if it's just some small thing that goes wrong, it can create a whole chain of bad events. And so that's why it's so important to save small species that are going extinct.
Meet the Ocean is produced by Paul North and Andrew Gettings, with sound design by Kelsey Anderson and music by Vin Gast. Special thanks to Taya and her father Sean for sharing some perspective on what it's like to live in Alaska. Check out some of Sean's photography on his Instagram at Glacier Bay Photo. We are a listener-supported nonprofit. You can find more podcasts, underwater creatures, and ways to donate to our educational outreach on our website, meettheocean.org. Subscribe to our podcast to never miss an episode, support us on Patreon, and please rate and review Meet the Ocean on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you choose to listen. Until next time, may the saltwater be with you.